Well, welcome. My name's June Wispelwey. I'm the Executive Director and CEO of AICHE. And I'm really glad we could all be here today. I want to think of this as more celebrating the life of Scott Fogler. Scott Fogler holds a really special place in my heart. He was the first president when I started as Executive Director. And a lot of you know him because he was a rock star, in chemical reaction engineering, having written textbook in that. You know him as a rock star for problem solving. But I know him because he really was a rock star. When the president usually, except in the time of COVID, I usually travel throughout the world with them. And I traveled a lot with Scott. Wherever Scott would go, there'd be a group of people following, asking for his autograph. Because who doesn't want to get an autograph from, Scott Fogler, the father of the Chemi car, as well as in reaction engineering. When he was president, he was also writing an update to his book. And what some of you don't know is there's a couple of those problems that were problems that he had to solve when he was president. Scott created the Chemi car, so the story goes, because he really wanted to engage students. And he thought that there was no better way to get students engaged than having them solve a problem, a real problem. And over the course of time, that the Chemi car, you may not know it, but it really has evolved. And it evolved because every year, Scott Fogler thought, how can we make it better? We can't have everyone competing, and dropping their car on the line. We have to make the problem harder. We have to change some things. And he was always looking at the world like that. We can always improve. And that's something I really took with me from his presidency. One of the funny stories is that as the new executive director, I took media training with Scott. And we sat for half a day in the office of a media trainer trying to teach us both what happens if. And one of the things we talked about was what happens if and the Chemi car blows up. Now, we were all trying to, we had all sorts of safety things, but what happens if the Chemi car blows up? And they told us, you should do this and you should say this. Based on what I know, I can say this. And if you ever hear, like, the pundits on TV, whenever you hear that, I go like, oh, geez, you're not really telling me the truth. It's sort of like, in my brain, I go like, I was taught that in media training. Well, at the end of media training, Scott goes to me and he says, June, he said, if the media come and they want to hear about the Chemi car and the history and everything, I got that. If the Chemi car blows up, it's yours. I also want to talk about some of the things he did, that have been really more meaningful. If you haven't figured out, AICHE is a big tent. We're really welcoming everyone in our tent. It's one of the reasons that we are such a vibrant community. And Scott really changed a lot of how AICHE felt about that. Through his push, John Chen sort of started our international expansion. And Scott really said, we've got to get the students globally to be involved in AICHE. And so his push was for student chapters worldwide. And we now have 400 student chapters, and more of them are outside the United States than inside the United States. That was really one of the things that he has done and that we have continued to do. But what he did, which was really special about it, is he made sure that the student chapters got connected and developed sister student chapters. And that was really important so that people can learn from each other. You know, Scott received a lot of prizes at AICHE, a lot of our awards, and one of the awards was for education. And he got that award because he really was a tremendous educator. And so, you know, I just want to say that I couldn't, you know, that last opportunity I talked to Scott was, I am going to be retiring next year. And I told Scott that. I called him up and I said, look, you know, I think it's about time. And he said, you know, I'm thinking it's about time too. He said, let's see who really retires first, though. Because at the time when I talked to him, I was thinking, well, maybe December, and it ends up it's going to be April. You know, he valued his family so much and really wanted to get time to spend with them. I'm so sorry he didn't get more time to spend with him and to spend with us as a community. And with that, I cannot say, you know, he just, once again, he holds a really special place in my heart. And I want to give the floor over to Sharon Glotzer, who is the chair of his department, who has a lot more to say about him from a professional standpoint, but from a volunteer standpoint, from a leader within AICHE, I think he's left a huge hole.
Well, thank you, June. Those are lovely remarks. And thank you to all of you for being here. I think Scott would have been thrilled to see so many people here to honor him. And on behalf of the department, I just want to thank everyone for being here. You know, Scott was a professor of chemistry at Michigan for 56 years. He was known to all of us in chemical engineering as a researcher, a scholar, a mentor, and as June said, most importantly, a skilled and accomplished educator. His enormous impact on chemical engineering quite literally changed the profession. I want to also thank June for, you know, when I shared the news about Scott, June reached out immediately and she said, I've got a slot at 11 a.m. on Monday. There's hardly anything else up against it. I'm giving it to you for Scott. And that was really, really meaningful. Scott joined the faculty of Michigan in 1965 as an assistant professor, fresh out of grad school at University of Illinois, where he met his wife, met and then married his now wife, Jan. He soon became the Venema Professor of Chemical Engineering at Michigan, then was awarded a Thurnau Professorship, which is a very prestigious professorship at Michigan for only the most outstanding educators, given by the provost. It's not possible to overstate just how passionate Scott was about teaching, especially teaching his students the tools and creative skills that they would use throughout their career to make a difference in the world. He was a true pioneer in chemical engineering education and in teaching students how to be more effective critical thinkers and critical problem solvers. He was among the very first to use computer modeling and simulation in teaching chemical engineering, and among the first to use the web to share his vast knowledge of reaction engineering. Most of us did not think of Scott as particularly tech savvy, but he actually was very much ahead of his time. His textbook, Elements of Chemical Reaction Engineering, was really pivotal to his remarkable national and international impact. Elements has prepared literally generations of chemical engineers, and it's the #1 selling chemical reaction engineering textbook of all time, used in 3/4 of all chemical engineering departments worldwide, which is a stunning accomplishment. The first edition of his textbook came out just over 30 years ago, but Scott was constantly improving it. I mean, always improving it. Whenever the next edition came out, already the next day he was working on the next edition. He was constantly improving it, assiduously, creatively, consistently, meaningfully updating the contents. He would already start talking to whoever was teaching the undergraduate reaction engineering course already, trying to get them to use the new edition, find mistakes in there for me. He would give, I think, $1 to his students. Anyone who ever found an error in the textbook, he would give them $1 to help him find these errors. The 6th edition was actually just published last year. Literally hundreds of thousands of chemical engineers around the world have learned reaction engineering kinetics from Scott's book. Most of us can only dream of making that kind of impact. In response to the news about Scott's death, the department received hundreds of emails, tweets, and messages from alumni and colleagues around the world, including many of you in this room, that reflect the impact he had on so many. One tweet read, "Professor Fogler was a true giant and a role model, a great educator whose teachings and legacy have crossed oceans and continents. I am more than grateful and honored to have been, through his textbook, one of his students, even though I never met him." John Carrier, who's a class of 1987 Michigan alum who used Scott's draft book chapters, wrote, "I was using what I learned in his class in his legendary book just a week ago with one of our clients. The fact that I'm able to remember and apply lessons from Fogler's book 35 years ago to nearly any business problem today is a tremendous tribute to him. And I'm sure that I'm just one of many, many students of his who can say the same." And Scott's textbook wasn't just a textbook. Again, here's where Scott was way ahead of his time. He developed a treasure trove of resources both to help students learn and to help instructors teach. There's PowerPoint slides for lectures, sample quizzes and exams, clicker questions for instructors, web-based learning modules, and computer simulation examples for students to use and instructors to use in class to supplement the chapters. His was an all-in, soup-to-nuts, modern integrated framework for learning one of the core subjects of chemical engineering. And it was funny, for those of you who have read the book, you'll know that it was full of little cartoons and corny jokes. Scott may have connected with hundreds of thousands of students through his textbook, but it was really in the classroom that perhaps he had his most profound impact. One of our alums wrote to me, "Professor Fogler changed my life. I loved his reaction engineering class because it was the first time I actually felt like a chemical engineer." Another alum wrote, "There are some rare moments that I remember as a student where I knew that I was in the presence of someone that was great and full of legacy inside of them. Scott Fogler was one of them. I never had someone teach me chemical engineering concepts with the clarity, confidence, boldness, and elegance like he did, and I'm so glad that he could spread his gift and purpose to the world." Scott died on August 21st, just shy of his 82nd birthday. He, at long last, was finally committed to retiring this coming December, next month, and assume emeritus status. Just 6 years ago, we celebrated Scott's 75th birthday, his 50th year at Michigan, and his 25th anniversary of his famous textbook, which all happened to coincide in the same year. He truly left a legacy that is unparalleled at Michigan and throughout the world of chemical engineering. Ravi Jain was a 1984 PhD alum and wrote, "Scott had amazing energy, zest for life, and kept pushing everyone around him to aim higher. During his career, Scott nourished many future leaders in chemical engineering, and even though he's gone, his legacy will live on for a long, long time." Baman Komami, chair of chemical engineering at UTK, wrote a very nice note, "This is indeed a tragic loss to our community. Scott was among the leaders in reaction engineering, and many of us were first introduced to the subject by his textbook. However, Scott's impact on the profession went way beyond the impact of his book, as he played a pivotal role in the evolution of reaction engineering in chemical engineering." Brian Grady, the chair of Chemie at the University of Oklahoma, wrote, "Many of my faculty are commenting on working with Scott and using his book. He most certainly was one of the most influential chemical engineers ever." Scott also co-authored Strategies for Creative Problem Solving, for which he won the American Society for Engineering Education's Distinguished Author Award. Over his long career, he received many honors and awards, like the Warren K. Lewis Award for Chemical Engineering Education from AICHE for his contributions of lasting educational influence, And he was still winning awards. Just in the last 4 years, Scott received an honorary doctorate from rlhoua University in Tarragona, Spain, which he was super proud of because also they gave him this funny little hat that he liked to wear for graduation. The AICHE Van Antwerpen Award for service to the Institute, and the ASEE's Cash Award for excellence in computing and chemical engineering education. And last year, Scott was thrilled to learn that he was to be named the State of Michigan's Distinguished Professor of the Year from the Michigan Association of State Universities. And of course, the award celebration had to be postponed, and we were all looking forward to the ceremonies that were to be held last month. And every single month for a year, he checked with me to make sure I had it on my calendar. Scott was, of course, also an exceptional researcher, and he worked on problems important to the oil and gas industry. And over his 56-year career, he mentored nearly 100 master's and PhD students, publishing with them hundreds of research articles on a range of important problems. Most recently, Scott worked on the costly problem of asphaltene and wax deposition in oil pipelines. Asphaltenes, of course, are found in petroleum crude oil, and when they deposit in pipelines and refineries, they clog up the works and make it harder for the oil to flow. Scott and his students worked to figure out how to remove these deposits and prevent asphaltenes from depositing in the first place. And because of his expertise, he was asked to serve on a National Academy study commissioned by the U.S. Department of Transportation as it related to the Keystone Pipeline. Scott enjoyed his research, but for him, it really was all about the students. He served for more than a decade until just a few years ago as Michigan's AICHE Student Chapter Faculty Advisor. And with Scott as their mentor, our chapter was honored with the Outstanding Student Chapter Award every single year. Scott was so proud when he last year was named the Outstanding Student Chapter Advisor of the Year. Among his many contributions, Scott also modernized the way chemical engineers teach safety. Obviously a topic of paramount importance to chemical engineers, but of really true importance to Scott. He created online interactive learning modules that dissect major accidents at chemical engineering plants, and the modules take the students through the sequence of events that led to the disaster, asking them to identify what went wrong and what decisions they would have taken to prevent it. The department will continue this important legacy of Scott's, which is used in now scores of departments. And just this past summer, Scott put his energy into mentoring our assistant professors, teaching them how to be successful and how to write successful grant proposals. He started, for example, an assistant professor handbook that will help new faculty navigate the, at times, mysterious road to tenure. Scott really was always doing something to make things better, whether it was working on the next edition of Elements of Reaction Engineering or something to help our students or alums or our junior faculty. Prodromos Doutidis at University of Minnesota sent an email to the department saying, Scott was an inspiring teacher, mentor, and friend to me. He had a unique ability to connect to people and was generous with his time and advice. He was, of course, a giant in chemical engineering education whose legacy will live forever. Leadership was also really important to Scott, and at the university he served the department and the college in all sorts of roles, including Associate Dean of the College of Engineering and Department Chair of Chemical Engineering. And just a few years ago, the College of Engineering established the H. Scott Fogler Award for Professional Leadership and Service, which was endowed by one of our alums. And this award is among the highest honors in the college. And this alum told me that she came to endow this award because she was visiting the department a few years ago and stopped into Scott's office. And she said, "Hi, Professor Fogler, I was in your class a million years ago." And he said, "Oh, I remember you. But back then, I was probably a son of a bitch." She says, "Yeah, well, you were kind of mean back then." He says, "I'm much more mellow now." And then he said, "Do you want to endow this award for me?" And she said, "Sure." Of course, one leadership role of which Scott was particularly proud was serving as the president of AICHE in 2009. And among his many achievements, Scott created the now infamous AICHE Chemi Car competition that June talked about. And in 2017, colleagues, friends, and former students established an endowment through AICHE to honor his legacy and commitment to the education of students in the practice of chemical engineering to support the Scott Fogler AICHE Chemi Car competition first place prize. While our own AICHE student chapter has yet to win this coveted prize, they are determined to soon. Scott cared deeply about making educational opportunities accessible to students around the globe. He traveled frequently to Thailand to teach reaction engineering and creative problem solving. He built a relationship with the Chulalongkorn University's Petroleum and Petrochemical College to provide Thai students opportunities to work with Chemi faculty. Laura Bracken, who's a longtime staff member in our department, was Scott's assistant for nearly 40 years. And she shared with us that Scott made it possible for 56 students from Chulalongkorn University, 49 students from the Indian Institute of Technology, and dozens of students from Sweden's KTH Royal Institute of Technology to come to the department to study. Scott also helped dozens of South African students from the University of Witwatersrand who had been adversely affected by their country's apartheid policies to study at Michigan. Always generous, always embracing of others, Scott gave similar opportunities over the years to students from Spain, Brazil, and China. Scott was absolutely beloved in South America. Several years ago, Scott sent me an email announcement of an upcoming trip to Brazil for a conference of undergraduate chemical engineering students, and he attached to the email a photo. This is the photo that I was trying to find and failed. But the photo was a photo of a practically life-size poster of Scott and his book that was made by the students on a black background. Scott was surrounded in a white glow, and there were only 3 words on the poster. They were in big letters, and they read, "He is coming." I will find that photo. It's somewhere in my email. 2 years ago, just 6 months before the pandemic would halt our in-person events, I was delighted that the department could celebrate with Scott his 80th birthday with a breakfast reception during our homecoming weekend and an evening reception at our AICHE fall meeting that year. And some of you may remember that at the reception, we served, among other things, these little shortbread cookies that are cycling through here, in case you're not sure what those are. Those are tiny little shortbread cookies. In Scott's image, his head is on the cookie. And he pretended at the time to be mildly amused by them, but then we later learned from Laura Bracken that he continued to order them from the baker and serve them to visitors in his department office. Despite all this talk about Scott's impact on and legacy in chemical engineering, that's actually not what Scott and I bonded over most. We actually, the two of us, bonded over television shows. 24, Damages, Justify, Money Heist, Broadchurch, Breaking Bad, Homeland, The Americans, and Prison Break were some of his favorites. It turns out that he and I liked all the same TV shows, which most people think is weird. I remember being so excited each week to share our theories about what Jack Bauer would do next on 24, or why Walter White on Breaking Bad couldn't just make good choices. We were always trying to outdo each other in finding the new greatest show ever. And when I would tell people that Scott and I shared the same taste in TV, they always looked at me with skepticism and incredulity, fully accepting that I would spend all my spare time watching television, but not Scott. Certainly, the great man does not spend his free time watching television. But in fact, Scott was very multidimensional. And for instance, he loved to cook, and he earned a certificate from the New Orleans School of Cooking back in 1985. So I didn't grow up with Scott's famous textbook, and to be honest, I didn't know the first thing about him when I joined the University of Michigan and the chemical engineering community just a little over 20 years ago. But I started noticing every time that I would go visit universities to give seminars and walk through the department and go from office to office meeting people, that everyone had this bright yellow book on their shelves. Every place I went, every department I visited, faculty would ask, faculty who knew Scott would ask, how's Fogler? Is Fogler still teaching? What's he doing? And those who hadn't met Scott but had learned from his textbook would always ask, what's Scott Fogler like? What's it like to work with him? So I figured out pretty early on that Scott was someone special in chemical engineering. But I don't think it hit me just how special and just what a dominant figure he was until one meeting some years ago. I went early to the AICHE meeting for the Saturday undergraduate sessions, which Scott attended every single year. This is the first year not having Scott here. And I ran into him on my way walking to the ballroom where they were going to give out the awards for ChemiCar and Outstanding Student Chapter. And there were several hundred students in the room. But what caught my eye was a line of students that was snaking up through the center of the room and going a little bit around the back. And so, I thought to myself, cool, there's food. But I didn't see anyone eating. And so Scott said, okay, go find us some seats up front and I'll be there in a few minutes. And as I walked down the aisle to go find seats in the front, I noticed that every student was holding a copy of his textbook. And I suddenly got it. They were all there to get him to sign their textbook. And sure enough, once this hit me, I looked back and I saw Scott there, just, enormous grin on his face. He could not have been happier. And in that moment, I could not have been prouder to be his colleague. The Chemical Engineering Department at Michigan deeply mourns this great loss, as do I. It came far too soon, and we just aren't ready to let go yet. I will miss Scott's constant optimism, his humor, his encouragement, his insights, his passion for education, and his TV show recommendations. May his memory be a blessing. And now I'd like to invite Warren Cedar up, a longtime colleague of Scott's, who will say a few words about Scott. This one? Got it. There you go, sir. Okay.
How impressive, Sharon. That was remarkable. You added so much to my understanding, and I think many others, of all the wonderful things that Scott did. It's an honor to have been invited to speak as one of many computing collaborators. That was the invitation with Scott. And I was a collaborator with him and many others for 40 years. And I'd like to begin with computing in Ann Arbor in the late 1950s, before Scott arrived. And so let's take a look at my slides here, if this works. It should, but that's not going. Let's try that. No. All right, there we go. Yep. Now, yes. Okay, so what I'd like to have you thinking about is that with several leaders in computing in the late 1950s, the great Professor Donald Katz, entered into the computing era. And he, many of you will probably recognize that at one point in his career, he He had authored the Natural Gas Handbook, a book on heat transfer in chemical engineering with John Knudsen. And now Katz is going into computing. Okay, so they got, in 1959, 1962, they got a Ford Foundation project on computers in chemical engineering education. They got $900,000 for that project, which by today's standards would probably be about over $10 million. So it was a very sizable project. And then in 1965 and the year that followed, they had an NSF project on computers in engineering design education. And this involved 300 engineering professors from across the United States who were exposed to computing, programming, numerical methods at the University of Michigan. They would go to Ann Arbor for this. And it was led by Professor Donald Katz. But there was this young graduate student, and that was Bryce Carnahan. And Bryce was excited about the different computer languages and so forth, and he joined Professor Katz in these two projects. Okay, so in 1969, we formed CASH, Computer Aids for Chemical Engineering Education. It was formed with emphasis on computers in chemical engineering design education. We had 15 founding members. We were using modern computers in research and teaching, and we were creating equation solvers and process simulators and databases and physical property estimation systems. And I mean, this was very challenging with the slow computers. There was a single computer for every university, and the early programming languages. So one focus that we looked at as a CASH committee was the process flow sheet simulator. So we thought, well, initially what we'll do is we'll create a more advanced simulator for use at universities. But after studying it fairly carefully, we recognized that the Monsanto Corporation had developed a remarkable flow sheet simulator called Flowtran. And they made it available to the universities over the United Computing Systems Network. They didn't have an internet back then. And we ended up writing a book about Flowtran, simulation, and introduction. And it turned out that that then led to a program called ASPEN, Advanced System for Process Engineering. And that led to Aspen Tech. Okay, so that was the evolution there. Okay, meanwhile, it turns out that several of the other initiatives of the CASH members involved laboratory computing, computer graphics, computer models for teaching, and process control. Okay, but along came this new initiative in reaction engineering. So in 1977, a few years later, we then elected Scott to be a CASH member. And he had been working on the elements of chemical kinetics and reactor calculations. That was the first book. It was a paper-bound, and in those days you did not do a paper-bound. Okay, but this was designed specifically. Each concept was introduced together with questions and exercises to test comprehension right there, and would help the students to set the pace of their learning in a more self-paced fashion. And of course, it was in a printed textbook before the advent of PCs and computer-aided instruction. One step ahead, certainly. Okay, looking for interaction, better interaction for the students. Okay, moving on. Then in the 1980s, the PCs appeared and the graphical user interfaces, and we were now thinking about graphics and interacting in a very different way. And so we developed something called the Cache IBM PC lessons for chemical engineering courses other than design and control. And we found some of the outstanding chemical engineers, involved in doing this. Morten had something, I had something in supercritical fluid extraction, John Seinfeld, Bruce Finlayson, and there's Scott. That was the first interactive kind of a program that he developed, heterogeneous reaction kinetics, and David Allen then at the University of Texas. Then came the Michigan project. This was a big deal with funding from the National Science Foundation, and it was basically Scott together with Susan Montgomery, who has made over the years a very big difference in that department. It had interactive PC modules for undergraduate chemical engineering education. And there were 5 of them in material energy balances and fluid mechanics and transport, another 5, separations 5, 9 in reaction kinetics. And they used an authoring system. This was ahead of its time, these kinds of authoring systems, something called Quest, with graphical animations, And the Cache members would actually get the modules as they were being developed and review them and help to develop them further. And then eventually the modules were distributed by Cache. So there's one of them, one of my favorites. At the time I was teaching separations, and everybody in chemical engineers know all about the McCabe-Thiele method. Well, they had developed this frame, and what you could do, of course, you recognize the Y versus the X and the equilibrium curve, phase equilibrium curve and for distillation. And there were 5 possible things that you could specify. So right there, let me see if I can make this work properly. All right, 1, 2, 3, 3 of the 5. And this was the first time that you could actually take, that bar and move it over with a, essentially your pointer. And all right, that would essentially set the distillate flow rate as a fraction of the feed flow rate, and then you would have the quality of the feed, just how much vapor, how much liquid, and the reflux ratio. And the others would be computed, but most important, as you were doing the sliding, what you found was the operating lines were being moved, just gradually, continuously. And there's the quality of the feed line. And the number of stages was stepped off. And boy, to learn how to do McCabe-Thiele with this kind of interaction was fabulous. And he had 25 of these, or Susan and he had 25 of these that were distributed around the world. It was a step ahead of its time. Now then came something called polymath. That was an important development in the following sense. 2 people, Mike Cutlip, Connecticut, Mordecai Shalcom from Ben-Gurion University in the Negev. They developed a student-oriented interface for implementing an increasingly sophisticated set of numerical methods linked to MATLAB and Excel. And it solved the linear equations and nonlinear equations and so on. Much of this was done in Ann Arbor. Why? Because they attracted the computing people, computing-oriented people. He wanted to be with Bryce. Bryce wrote the book, Applied Numerical Methods. 300,000 copies that book sold. They just wanted to be together. And Scott was writing the next version of his book. They wanted to be able to provide the kinds of software that the students could solve all those problems. With polymath. So, there's the book. And Sharon's already done a beautiful job on this one. I was going to say 80%. She said 75%, which is just fine. It's just used all around the world. And the problems are solved with polymath. So it's almost like that first book. You go from learning something, and then you solve a problem with polymath, and you see the solution, and you change things, and so forth. Each student in those days, when the book first came out, hardbound like this, they got a CD, and they could run the CD on their computers. Okay, so that was a big deal. Okay. One other thing that I think is so important, and Sharon sort of glossed over it to some extent, but it provided for design instructors like myself a rich source of chemical reaction mechanisms, okay? And they were just perfect for incorporation in process design studies, okay? He provided the students many examples of the kinds of reaction systems used in industry. Okay, many examples excuse me, and these examples, I want to make this point, were in prior books had involved overworked A, B, C, D type chemicals, and that was the beauty of this book, is it had at least 50 different examples of chemical reaction systems. Okay, moving on then. I think Sharon mentioned this, and I'll mention it very quickly. Throughout, Scott was focusing on teaching engineering problem solving in another book. Okay, she mentioned it with Steve LeBlanc and Berizzo. And I mean, as you're doing this, you have to generate ideas for setting up a model to solve the problem. You have to get involved with heuristics, rules of thumb. You have to implement and evaluate solutions, and you have to troubleshoot the various methods to see whether the results are looking proper. But I just simply like to say that not coincidentally, these approaches parallel those in my textbook, Product and Process Design Principles. That's exactly what we do. We start out with the idea generation, of course, and then the heuristics and so on and so. Just wanted to mention that. Okay, so for over 40 years, so many of us benefited from Scott's many contributions to computer-aided instruction in CASH and from his textbooks. And he shared his vast insights, certainly with me, with all of CASH and the entire chemical engineering profession, for so much of which I believe he was a very happy and proud individual and is sorely missed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Warren. And now we're going to hear from Ryan Hartman, an associate professor of chemical engineering at NYU and a former student of Scott Fogler's.
Well, it's really an honor to be here. As Sharon mentioned, I'm one of Scott's former PhD students, and in the time I have, I'm going to speak about his research and education contributions through some of the experiences of his former PhD students. So Scott completed his doctoral degree in 1965 at the University of Colorado with Professor Klaus Timmerhaus on the effect of ultrasonic waves on mass transfer, and he was hired that same year by Professor Stuart Churchill, then the department chairman of chemical engineering at the University of Michigan. His research engagement with Chevron also started that same year, and while on military leave with Fort MacArthur in San Pedro, he researched solid rocket fuels at the Jet Propulsion Laboratories, and he taught a reaction engineering course in the evening. Now, it's my understanding that right up to the start of that course, the enrollment was just one shy of the requirements for it to go ahead. And serendipity in action, one late registration, and Scott began teaching reaction engineering for the first time in his career. So some students in his class also worked at Chevron, and he was asked to consult there, and the rest is history. Together with his first graduate students, they established a research direction investigating flow and reaction in porous media. And his doctoral students from the mid-1970s to the mid-1980s studied the catalyzed dissolution of silicate minerals in hydrochloric and hydrofluoric acid mixtures for sandstone acidization. Their research discovered different mineral dissolution regimes from reaction rate limited to mass transfer limited, and they also innovated early laboratory techniques by injecting the acid mixtures into sandstone cores in which they developed basic models for porosity permeability relationships. Their work set the stage for Scott's career-long interest in upstream engineering in the petroleum industry, and he would always stress to us the importance of performing fundamental research as opposed to look-see research based on scientific principles while challenging conventional wisdom. Now, hydrocarbon-bearing reservoirs worldwide are complex. They're diverse in their chemistry, geology, pore-scale physics, and operating conditions, and Scott's research program quickly grew in the 1980s and 1990s to a more comprehensive understanding of flow, mineral dissolution, precipitation, colloidal particle physics within the porous media, and formation damage mechanisms, with each of these topics generating important dissertations. They also became interested in the placement of the injected fluids in subterranean reservoirs by studying foam gels and emulsions that can modify the permeability of the porous media. And his students eventually shifted their focus to carbonate reservoir acidization, where they derived models that characterize a phenomenon called wormhole formation that results from a competition between mass transport and dissolution rates within porous carbonates. Scott's work on flow and reaction in porous media generated first principle predictive models that industry quickly adopted and some continue to use even to this day. Now, the precipitation of inorganic scale later emerged as an important problem in that industry, and significant dissertations were generated from Scott's lab on the stability of alkaline earth metals, post-transition metals, and metalloids that form coordination complexes with organic acids. And basic understanding of these chelating complexes would later result in some of the most chemically advanced reservoir stimulation technology in the world. Scott was so forward-thinking that his students even began working on glass micromodels in the mid-1990s that emulate porous media, which are just now taking off in recent years. In the late 1990s, it was also thought that bacterial profile modification of the porous reservoirs could influence fluid placement and hydrocarbon production, and important dissertations from Scott's laboratory on that topic characterized the growth of bacterial colonies and the resultant biomass generation with fundamental understanding of its impact on pore-scale physics. So as that industry progressed, the flow assurance of fluids from the reservoir to their collection point downstream became the center of operational challenges, and Scott and his students were thinking ahead once again as paraffin wax and asphaltenes deposits were key flow assurance problems. So his students' early work in the mid-1990s investigated the stability of asphaltenes, which was also a continuation of his last PhD dissertation. Several important theses were published in the 2000s to the 2010s, including an early understanding of asphaltenes characterization, nanoaggregation kinetics and mechanisms, fractal dimensions, precipitation, and even new experimental techniques which industry adopted for the study of asphaltenes. The late 1990s also saw the start of Scott's work on wax deposition, which continued through the 2000s, and several theses from his laboratory examined paraffin gelation, bulk crystallization, transport-limited wall deposition modeling, computational fluid dynamics simulation predictions, and fused chemical reactions for controlled heat release to remediate wax blockages in subsea pipelines. Now, research in Scott's laboratory was in education and problem solving, and the word open-ended was used frequently. What he was training us for, he emphasized, was not just to answer questions, but to follow those questions wherever they might take us. Peeling the onion to get to the core, Socratic reasoning, Gedanken thought experiments were all integral to his research philosophy, just as his passion was for discovery and developing predictive models in which he would say, always start from first principles. Our laboratory meetings went on for hours on Friday afternoons and often into the evenings as we defined the problem and examined every assumption, data point, condition, method, model, etc. And as we questioned what would happen at the extremes. Scott published quality research, and he wouldn't settle for anything other than conclusive results. And in true Professor Fogler fashion, he would center his remarks around objectivity, collegiality, and respect. He told us, you must respect the data, and even when pointing out error, you must assume competence and goodwill. And in a world filled with chaos and conflict, he somehow created a nest for us to make deep connections with each other, questioning one another's theory, welcoming and transparent to our diverse cultural backgrounds, yet at the same time an educational opportunity to learn about the world without some of us yet having traveled it. Scott was a visionary and a dedicated advisor, and his infamous industrial affiliates program at Michigan is just one example. He built a world-class research consortium of the leading oil and gas companies a decade before industry academic consortium models were widely adopted. His affiliates program was one of the longest, if not the longest, running industrial consortia in the College of Engineering at Michigan, supporting his students in their research for over 35 years. And while practicing presentations for our annual sponsor meetings, Scott invested his time to critique every statement, data plot, formatting style, conclusion, etc., and he would meet again for more practice if we needed it. Our manuscripts were returned after many hours of red ink, some more than others, with acronyms like pizza, where the word this was written before a verb instead of a noun. He cared much more about our education than just our engineering skills, encouraging us to learn how to market our research, build professional relationships, and network with companies who supported us. While other students hit the slopes or were off to the beach on their spring break, we traveled around the United States presenting our research at major corporations where some of the top industrial scientists and engineers in the world would ask us questions. Scott would provide any opportunity for us to grow, and he never failed to remind us before leaving for the airport where at dinner we could practice our soft skills. Each of us really cherishes the picture-framed academic family tree that Scott would gift immediately following our PhD defense and introducing us for the first time as doctor. And in all, Scott, with his 45 doctoral students and 49 master's students, published more than 240 research articles, the majority of which are on the application of chemical engineering principles to upstream petroleum engineering. In recognition of his research, Scott received the Malcolm E. Pruitt Award from the Council for Chemical Research in 2010, and his expertise was sought for President Obama's commission to study and make a recommendation on the flow of diluted bitumen in the Keystone Pipeline, which he served for 2 years. And overall, he's been the recipient of 13 named lectureships and has delivered invited lectures in 25 countries worldwide. Now, we all know Scott devoted his entire career, 56 years, to the University of Michigan, and there he is more than a prolific educator. And by how much is more obvious with a simple back-of-the-hand calculation. So multiplying the number of editions of his textbook, Elements of Chemical Reaction Engineering, by the number of pages revised, and divided by the difference between the first edition year and the last year that it was published yields a number of approximately 200. Now you could perform the same calculation on a basis of his years of service. In either case, a comparison of Scott's number to the top 10 leading chemical reaction engineering textbooks reveals that he was about 2 to 2.5 times more productive. So Scott used to call one of our classmates Doctor, because he did enough work for 2 dissertations in one. I think it's safe to say that Scott was Professor Fogler. Now, Professor Fogler has authored or co-authored 12 textbooks, including Essentials of Chemical Reaction Engineering. And I was really humbled when Pearson asked me some years ago to review his new textbook, and Scott took every single one of my comments as serious as if they were his own, as he made revisions into the second edition. We also heard that he co-authored Strategies for Creative Problem Solving with former student Stephen LeBlanc, and for that they won the American Society for Engineering Education's Miriam Wiley Distinguished Author Award. In addition to that, the ASCHE Warren K. Lewis Award for Chemical Engineering Education for contributions of lasting educational influence. His textbooks have dominated the world market for the past 25 years and have helped prepare generations of chemical engineers. And Scott's assistant, Laura Bracken, who all of his students adored working with as well, was so integral to his far-reaching achievements. As a global educator, Scott provided students who didn't have the opportunity to come to Michigan an education in chemical engineering. He cared so much about students from other countries, including underdeveloped or developing countries, that he translated his books so they could learn better. He also started teaching reaction engineering courses in Thailand in the early 1990s and later Australia, Brazil, and South Africa. He took students every year from India, Mexico, South Africa, Thailand, Vietnam, to name a few, through special programs that he developed for visiting scholars and master's students. He mentored doctoral students from China, India, Korea, Thailand, and Vietnam, supporting a culturally diverse research group. And Scott also practiced different foreign languages with us, with his random introduction of phrases during our laboratory meetings. And every day, he also chose an impactful word in English as practice too. The creativity of his works made it obvious that Scott had fun being a professor. We all heard that he created the Chemie car competition. And being the gifted educator he was, he could see across generations. He had a passion and interest in the 2010s and millennials, in which he invested deep thought on how to evolve the engineering education to better understand how to teach future generations. His textbook problems often involved real case studies or scripted investigations where not even Sherlock Holmes stood a chance, like something from the movies. Scott taught his students how to be problem solvers by applying chemical reaction engineering principles to just about anything, from hippopotamus digestion, snakebite envenomation, and computer chip manufacturing, to environmental remediation, solar energy, and transdermal drug delivery. And in more recent years, as we just heard, he led an initiative to teach process safety across chemical engineering curriculum by creating safety modules of real-life cases for all core chemie courses. Scott and his wife, Jan, created so many wonderful memories for their doctoral students. He was always so appreciative and thankful for those who contributed, dedicating his life's works to his wife, family, students, colleagues, and collaborators. He had a really big heart and cared deeply for us, responding to impromptu emails, telephone calls, and visits, even as recent as this past summer, providing us advice when we needed it, with deep admiration for our successes. If any one of his doctoral students was to draw a list of people who have had the most influence on their lives, the list would likely be short, and Scott would be on it. He set a wonderful example of character for us to look up to, ingrained in honesty, integrity, humility, empathy, healthy ambition, and desire to help people or organizations solve impactful problems. I'd like to finish by thanking his wife, Jan, who couldn't be here. Together with Scott, you welcomed us into your home and as part of a wonderful family. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan, Sharon, and Warren, for such wonderful reflections on Scott. We are running out of time, but if there is a burning, someone has something they burningly want to say, please step up to the mic and provide your thoughts. Dave?
I just wanted to take this in a different direction for Scott. Scott and I served as board of directors from '94 to '97, and if Scott loved his profession and his family, what he also loved a lot was sports. He loved his Detroit Red Wings. He found out that I was from Philadelphia in the '97 meeting, at our '97 meeting, and we watched the Stanley Cup Finals together where the Detroit Red Wings won Game 4 and blew my Flyers right out of the water. And ever since that moment, he taunted me every time he saw me. And he always taunted about his Red Wings. So that was a memory I have of Scott, that every time I saw him, he would say, my Red Wings are always better than my Flyers.
Well, very good. And thank you all for coming today. I'm sure that this will mean a lot to Scott's family, his AICHE family. Yep, come on, please. We have another.
My name is Letícia Zarpelon, and I'm from Brazil. Like she mentioned before, everybody loves him there. I never met him in person. I was actually excited when I got approved for a poster session here that I was going to meet him, but unfortunately that was not possible. I was the first president of the first student chapter in Brazil, so we started this because of him. He was a friend of my professor, Flavio. He was the translator of his book in Brazil. And yes, you know Flavio?
Yes.
And I was his student, and he came to me and he's like, oh, I have a friend from the US, Professor Fogler. He has a program from AICHE in the US, and we would like to bring one here in Brazil, and we never had anything. And I'm like, what am I going to do? I don't even know anything about this, but he changed my life because I'm here talking to you. I'm super nervous right now, but it was because of him, because I started doing presentations. I started going around Brazil to try to multiply the student chapters over there. Today, I think we have over 10 student chapters there, and I'm super proud of that. And I really wish I could have met him, but I think that he was really important in my life.
Yep. Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank everyone for coming today. I'm sure this means a lot to Scott and his, and his family and the department and all of his friends. Thank you.